Have you ever noticed how some people live with the constant feeling that something bad is about to happen, even when nothing apparently is wrong? The day feels normal. The environment is calm. No emergency has happened. But still, the mind keeps waiting, as if some invisible threat were slowly approaching, a feeling that is difficult to explain. You don't know exactly what, you don't know exactly when, but the system stays prepared, watching, anticipating, monitoring small signals. And maybe the most exhausting part of all of this is exactly that. Most of the time, nothing happens. But the brain keeps acting as if it needs to stay ready for something. Now think about that for a moment. How many times have you finally resolved one worry, only for your mind to immediately find another one? As if the brain had difficulty remaining without some kind of internal alert. You solve one problem and immediately start thinking about the next one. You receive good news. But part of your mind asks, what if this changes? Everything seems stable, but your body still remains partially prepared. And this creates an extremely silent state. You are not exactly in panic, but you also never feel completely safe. You remain in a kind of continuous preparation, as if the brain were always waiting for something to interrupt stability. And there is a very important reason for that. The human mind was not built only to react to danger. It was built to predict the possibility of danger. There is a central concept in neuroscience called predictive processing. The brain is constantly trying to anticipate what may happen before it happens. That increases survival, increases adaptation, increases response capacity. The problem is that a system that spent too much time in a state of alert can begin predicting threats even during safe moments. And when that happens, the brain loses familiarity with the feeling of continuous calm. Now notice something important. Most people believe anticipatory anxiety appears because there is too much thinking. But many times, thinking is the consequence of a brain that already entered a state of physiological preparation. First, the system feels the need for vigilance. Then the mind starts searching for reasons to justify that vigilance. That completely changes the perspective. Because maybe you are not consciously expecting something bad. Maybe your system simply learned that relaxing too much can be risky. There is a mechanism called negative anticipation bias. The brain tends to prioritize potentially threatening possibilities. That does not mean pessimism. It means adaptive survival. For thousands of years, anticipating danger increased protection. Those who noticed signals earlier survived more. But the modern brain still uses this same mechanism, even in environments where most threats are not physical anymore. Now imagine someone living for years with unpredictability, constant pressure, emotional instability, hyperstimulation, continuous need for adaptation. The brain silently learns something. We need to stay prepared. And then preparation stops being temporary. It becomes a baseline state. There is a concept in psychophysiology called residual readiness. Even after the end of a stressful situation, the system remains partially activated, like an alarm that never completely shuts off. The body partially returns to normal, but never fully. And that creates something extremely common today, the feeling that the brain never completely relaxes. Now notice how this appears in small details of daily life. You receive a message and immediately imagine negative possibilities. Someone takes too long to reply, and the brain starts interpreting scenarios. Something changes slightly in the routine, and the system enters monitoring mode. Not because there is real danger, but because the brain became used to searching for signals. There is another important concept called adaptive hypervigilance. When the system spends too much time trying to avoid problems, it starts observing everything with heightened intensity. Facial expressions, tone changes, silences, small details, possible rejection, possible conflict. The brain learns every detail may matter, and this creates a very specific experience. You never feel like you can completely lower your guard. Now think about the impact of that over time. The system keeps anticipating, simulating, predicting, monitoring. even during moments that should be restful. And maybe that is exactly why so many people say, I can't simply relax, because the brain keeps waiting for the next problem. There is another very important detail. The human brain learns through emotional repetition. Whatever happens repeatedly, the system begins considering probable. So imagine someone who lived through many periods of disappointment, instability, criticism, overload, prolonged tension, constant need for adaptation. The brain silently learns something. Good moments do not last. And then one of the quietest forms of modern anxiety appears. The person even experiences positive moments. But part of the mind keeps waiting for interruption, as if happiness required vigilance. Now notice how this changes even simple experiences. You begin something good, but the brain asks, what if it goes wrong? You receive peace, but the system keeps monitoring. The problem ends, but the body stays prepared. There is a concept in cognitive psychology called defensive anticipation. The brain tries to predict negative scenarios to reduce emotional impact if they happen. It is as if the system believes, if I prepare myself, it will hurt less later. But there is an enormous cost to that, because continuous preparation prevents full presence. The mind never fully enters the present moment. Part of it remains living in the next possible problem. And living constantly inside the next possible problem is deeply exhausting. Now notice something even deeper. Not every feeling of threat comes from something external. Sometimes the brain reacts to internal states: fatigue, uncertainty, silence, lack of control, subtle physical sensations. There is a psychosomatic concept called predictive bodily amplification. When the system is hyperactivated, the brain starts interpreting small bodily sensations as relevant signals. A muscle tension becomes an alert. A strange sensation becomes concern. A slight change in energy becomes monitoring. The body speaks, and the brain immediately tries to predict meaning. That helps explain why some people feel something feels wrong, even without being able to identify what. Because the system is not necessarily reacting to facts, it is reacting to the possibility of threat. Now think about something curious. Have you noticed how certain people cannot fully enjoy good moments? They relax partially, but never completely, as if the brain kept waiting for change. That happens because the system learns continuity. If for a long time it was necessary to remain alert, the brain keeps operating from that pattern. There is a concept in chronobiology called adaptive circadian anticipation. The brain creates physiological predictions based on repeated experiences over time. If certain times, environments, or situations were frequently associated with tension, the system begins anticipating activation automatically. That is why some people feel anxiety late in the afternoon, restlessness at night, uneasiness before sleep, tension upon waking, even without a clear conscious reason. The body learned temporal patterns of vigilance. Now notice the depth of that. Maybe your mind is not exaggerating. Maybe it is simply repeating predictions learned for too long. That completely changes the conversation, because it removes the focus from guilt and places it on the adaptive functioning of the nervous system. You stop thinking, what is wrong with me? And begin realizing, my brain learned to survive by staying prepared. And that understanding changes everything, because understanding the pattern reduces internal conflict. And reducing conflict already begins decreasing activation. Now notice something extremely important. The brain does not clearly differentiate between real threat, imagined threat, and anticipated threat. If the system believes something might happen, the body partially responds as if it were already happening. There is a mechanism called emotional predictive simulation. The brain creates internal experiences based on possible future scenarios, and that can keep the system in a state of alert even without concrete events. Maybe that is exactly why so many people today feel exhausted, even when nothing happened, because the brain spent the entire day preparing itself, preparing for problems, preparing for conflicts, preparing for mistakes, preparing for negative possibilities. And constant preparation also consumes energy, a lot of energy. Now notice something even more interesting. There is an enormous difference between healthy prevention and chronic vigilance. Healthy prevention resolves and releases. Chronic vigilance never feels complete closure. It keeps searching, continuously. And maybe this is exactly where many people get trapped without realizing it. The brain begins by trying to protect, but ends up creating continuous exhaustion. Because the system never receives enough signals of safety. It never feels, it's over. Everything is okay. We can shut down now. And when that signal never arrives, the mind keeps waiting, as if something were still about to happen. There is a neuroscience concept called defensive affective forecasting. The brain does not only react to what is happening, it tries to predict the emotional impact of what might happen. And that creates something extremely important. The system starts preparing itself before any concrete problem even exists. Now think about this. If for a long time the brain learned that it needed to avoid disappointment, prevent conflicts, anticipate losses, reduce emotional risks, monitor subtle changes in the environment, then the very act of expecting problems starts feeling like protection. As if the brain were saying, if I prepare beforehand, maybe it will hurt less later. But there is a silent detail hidden inside all of this. Constant preparation also keeps the body in a constant state of activation, and continuous activation deeply changes physiology. There is a system called the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. It directly participates in stress responses and bodily preparation. When the brain perceives threat or possibility of threat, this system increases cortisol, vigilance, selective attention, environmental monitoring. The problem is that the modern brain often activates this mechanism without real physical danger. Emotional possibility is enough, possibility of failure, possibility of rejection, possibility of instability, possibility of loss, possibility of losing control, and then the body reacts as if it needed to prepare immediately. Now imagine living like this for months or years. The brain starts considering this state its basic mode of functioning, and that changes something extremely important: the perception of the future. Notice how some people always live emotionally one step ahead, never fully in the present, always trying to predict what could go wrong, what might change, what they need to avoid, what they need to control. As we saw, there is a cognitive psychology concept called negative anticipation bias. When the brain spends too much time trying to avoid threats, it automatically begins prioritizing potentially problematic scenarios, not because the person wants to think negatively, but because the system believes predicting problems increases safety. Now notice the trap. The more the brain searches for risks, the more possibilities it finds. And the more possibilities it finds, the more activated it remains. This creates an extremely common feeling today, the feeling that it is never possible to fully relax, because there is always something that could happen. Now think about something curious. Have you ever noticed how some people feel temporary relief when something bad finally happens? That sounds strange, but there is a neuropsychological explanation for it. While the brain is anticipating threat, it remains in continuous tension. When the event finally happens, even if unpleasant, part of the uncertainty disappears, and the reduction of uncertainty can create momentary relief. That reveals something profoundly important. Many times the brain fears anticipation more than the event itself. There is a concept called predictive intolerance. The system suffers while trying to sustain undefined possibilities. And so it creates strategies, monitoring, analyzing, predicting, rehearsing scenarios, simulating conversations, imagining responses. All of this works as an attempt to reduce unpredictability. But there is one detail. Life never offers total predictability, so the brain keeps functioning without closure. Now notice how this appears in daily life. You receive a message and think, did something happen? Someone changes their tone of voice, and the brain starts interpreting possibilities. Something takes longer than expected, and the mind already creates scenarios, not because there is concrete evidence, but because the system became conditioned to anticipate risk before confirming safety. There is another extremely important concept called contextual neuroception. The nervous system evaluates environmental patterns before the rational mind consciously interprets them. Small changes, facial expressions, silences, delays, routine changes, breaks in predictability, can automatically be interpreted as a need for extra attention. And that keeps the brain partially prepared all the time. Now imagine the impact of that on rest. The body may stop, but the brain keeps checking possibilities. There is always one part observing. What if I forgot something? What if something happens? What if I need to prepare? And maybe that is exactly what so many people describe as, my mind never shuts off. Notice something even deeper. Many people believe they are exhausted because of too many tasks, but in many cases, the greatest exhaustion comes from constant anticipation. Anticipating consumes energy. Monitoring consumes energy. Rehearsing scenarios consumes energy. Keeping the body prepared consumes energy. But because all of this happens internally, the exhaustion feels invisible. There is a psychosomatic concept called chronic anticipatory tension. The organism remains partially prepared to respond, even without immediate necessity. And that generates fatigue, muscle tension, a racing mind, difficulty relaxing, emotional hypersensitivity. Now notice something curious. The longer the brain stays in this pattern, the more it starts interpreting neutrality as suspicious. Silence feels strange. Calm feels temporary. Good moments feel too good to last, as if the system were constantly waiting for the next break in stability. There is a cognitive mechanism called continuous defensive forecasting. The brain tries to reduce negative emotional impact by predicting scenarios before they happen. But there is an unavoidable problem in that. The brain does not clearly distinguish possibility from probability, so simply imagining something bad can make the system start partially reacting as if it were much closer than it actually is. Now think about the impact of that on the body. Breathing changes. Muscle tension increases. Attention becomes hyper-focused. Sleep loses depth. The sympathetic nervous system stays more activated. All of this without a real emergency. And then the person starts living in a constant state of pre-alert, not completely in danger, but never completely safe. There is another extremely important concept from chronobiology. The human brain depends on predictable rhythms to reduce vigilance. Light, sleep, schedules, environmental patterns. When there is excessive unpredictability or excessive continuous stimulation, the system loses physiological references of stability, and a brain without clear references of stability increases monitoring. Now notice how the modern world intensifies this. Constant notifications, rapid changes, excessive information, continuous comparison, uninterrupted stimulation. The brain never receives enough signals of closure. Everything feels potentially important. Everything feels potentially urgent. And so the system learns, I need to stay prepared. Maybe that is exactly why so many people feel something difficult to explain. The constant feeling that something is about to happen, even when they do not know exactly what. There is also a concept called anxiety without a defined object. The body enters a state of preparation, but there is no clear identifiable threat. And that creates an extremely confusing experience, because the person feels tension, expectation, restlessness, diffuse worry, but cannot point to a specific cause. So the brain starts searching for explanations, and the more it searches, the more possibilities it finds. Now notice something profoundly important. Maybe your mind is not trying to sabotage you. Maybe it simply learned that constant vigilance reduces vulnerability. That completely changes the perspective, because it removes the focus from guilt and places it on the adaptation of the system. You stop thinking, "What is wrong with me?" and begin realizing, "My brain learned to survive by staying prepared." And that difference changes everything, because a learned pattern can also be relearned. But before that happens, the system first needs to perceive something it may not have felt in a very long time. Enough safety to stop constantly waiting for the next problem. Now notice something even deeper. The brain does not learn only through major events. It learns through emotional repetition. Repeated small experiences of instability, unpredictability, hypervigilance, constant pressure, emotional monitoring eventually teach the system that fully relaxing may be risky. And when that happens, the mind begins living permanently oriented toward the future. Not a positive future, but a preventive future, as if part of the brain were always trying to arrive before the next problem. Now notice something even deeper. There is an important difference between thinking about a problem and living in a constant state of emotional preparation. Many people believe they are simply being careful, responsible, prepared. But in many cases, the brain has already crossed the line of healthy caution. It started operating as if danger were inevitable, and that completely changes the way the mind interprets the future. There is a neuroscience concept called negative predictive bias. When the brain spends too much time anticipating difficulties, it automatically starts prioritizing potentially threatening scenarios, not because those scenarios are more likely, but because the system believes predicting the worst increases survival. Now think about that carefully. If for a long time your mind learned that it needed to avoid frustration, prevent rejection, anticipate losses, prepare for problems, monitor emotional risks, the brain begins interpreting the future through the filter of threat, and then an extremely silent experience appears. You do not feel exactly clear fear. You feel preparation, as if part of the mind were constantly organizing internal resources for something difficult that may happen. And that is extremely exhausting, because continuous preparation consumes energy, even when nothing happens. There is another important concept called baseline anticipatory anxiety. The system remains activated not because of a present problem, but because of the constant expectation of future possibility. And the most important detail is this: possibility. The brain does not need certainty to activate vigilance. It only needs to perceive potential threat. Now notice how this appears in daily life. You receive a short message and immediately try to interpret the tone. Something takes longer than expected, and the mind starts creating scenarios. A small change happens, and the brain automatically tries to predict consequences. Not because there is necessarily danger, but because the system learned that anticipation reduces vulnerability. But there is a trap in that. Constant anticipation makes the brain lose contact with the present. The mind begins living several steps ahead all the time. There is a concept in cognitive psychology called anxious temporal displacement. Attention stops remaining in the present and begins functioning oriented toward possible futures. That deeply changes emotional experience, because the present never feels completely sufficient. There is always something to prevent, something to avoid, something to monitor, something to prepare for. Now imagine the impact of that over months or years. The brain begins living in a continuous state of pre-response, as if it were always waiting for an invisible emotional emergency. And maybe that is exactly what so many people feel, but cannot explain. They are not living in panic, but they are also never living in complete peace. They remain in an in-between state, a silent readiness, as if fully relaxing would be careless. There is another extremely important concept called predictive emotional memory. The brain uses past experiences to try to predict future protection. That means that if at some point in life, the unexpected brought pain, Unpredictability brought suffering, relaxation preceded frustration, trust ended in emotional threat. The system learns something very dangerous. We cannot fully lower our guard. And then the brain transforms vigilance into an automatic survival mechanism. Now notice the depth of that. Many people believe they live worried because something wrong is happening. But in many cases, worry became a neurophysiological habit. The system became so accustomed to predicting threat that the absence of worry starts feeling strange. There is a neuropsychology concept called conditioned emotional familiarity. The brain tends to repeat familiar emotional states, even when they create suffering, because familiarity produces predictability, and predictability reduces uncertainty. Do you see the inversion? Sometimes the mind remains trapped in states of alert, not because it likes them, but because they became familiar. Now think about this. Some people feel strange when everything is finally okay. The environment is calm, the problems decreased, life slowed down, but the brain keeps waiting for impact, as if silently saying, "It's too calm. Something must happen. Better stay prepared." And that helps explain an extremely common phenomenon: the inability to fully trust stability. There is always a feeling that peace may end at any moment. Now notice something even more interesting. The human brain does not perfectly distinguish physical threat from emotional threat. Criticism, rejection, failure, shame, loss of control, prolonged uncertainty. All of this can activate circuits similar to physical survival responses. And then the system reacts as if it needed to protect you constantly. There is a psychosomatic concept called defensive bodily anticipation. The body starts responding before any concrete problem even exists. Breathing changes, muscles tighten, attention increases, sleep loses depth, all because the brain is preparing for something that may never happen. Now imagine living like this for a long time. The entire system starts reorganizing its physiology around anticipation. There is an important chronobiological impact in this. The human brain functions through natural cycles of activation and recovery. But when the mind remains in continuous expectation, those cycles begin losing stability. Sleep becomes fragmented. Rest loses depth. Hormonal recovery decreases. The brain remains partially alert even during the night. And maybe that is exactly why so many people wake up exhausted, even after sleeping, because the body rested partially, but the system never fully left preparation mode. There is another important concept called residual nighttime hypervigilance. Even during periods of rest, part of the brain continues monitoring possible threats, and that reduces deep recovery. Now notice how this affects even small daily moments. You try to watch something relaxing, but continue thinking about possible problems. You try to rest, but feel the need to check messages. You try to enjoy a peaceful moment, but one part of the mind keeps waiting for interruption, as if the brain never completely believed that everything is okay now. There is a behavioral psychology phenomenon called preventive reinforcement. When a person believes predicting problems helped avoid suffering in the past, the brain strengthens anticipation behavior even more. And then overthinking feels useful. Monitoring feels responsible. Worrying feels protective. Never fully relaxing feels prudent. But there is an invisible cost to that. The system loses the ability to feel spontaneous safety, because safety requires something the hyper-adapted brain fears: tolerated uncertainty. Now think deeply about that. No human being can completely control the future, but some minds try to compensate for that impossibility through constant hyper-preparation, and that creates an extremely modern paradox. The more the brain tries to predict everything, the less it can rest. There is another important concept called the adaptive illusion of control. The brain creates a temporary feeling of safety by excessively analyzing future possibilities. But that feeling never lasts long, because there is always one more variable, one more possibility, one more scenario, and so the mind keeps functioning non-stop. Now notice how this changes even bodily perception. The hyper-prepared brain begins interpreting neutral signals as potential threats. A different silence, a facial expression, a small delay, a change in routine. Everything becomes a possibility for analysis. There is a concept called defensive interpretive amplification. The brain increases attention toward any ambiguous stimulus that could represent emotional risk. And the more that happens, the more exhausting the world becomes. Because everything requires monitoring. Now imagine someone living like this every day. The system never receives a full feeling of closure. There is always something to observe, something to predict, something to prepare for. And that creates one of the quietest forms of mental exhaustion, the fatigue of constant anticipation. Maybe that is why so many people struggle to explain their own exhaustion. They are not only overloaded with tasks, they are overloaded with internal vigilance. Notice something profoundly important. The brain was not born to predict threats all the time. It was designed to alternate between attention, presence, recovery, rest. But when the system learns that relaxing is dangerous, preparation never completely ends. And then the brain keeps waiting for something to happen, waiting for something to change, waiting for some invisible impact to appear, even when the present moment is silent. Now maybe you are beginning to understand something extremely important. Maybe your mind is not overreacting. Maybe it simply learned that staying prepared seemed necessary for emotional protection. And that changes everything, because it removes the focus from guilt and places it on the conditioning of the system. You stop thinking, "What is wrong with me?" and begin realizing, "My brain learned to survive by expecting threat." That understanding completely reorganizes the experience, because what was learned can also be relearned. But there is an important detail. The brain does not unlearn vigilance through force. It unlearns through repeated experiences of safety. Small moments where nothing bad happens, even without hypercontrol. Small moments where the system realizes it can reduce monitoring. Small moments where the mind experiences presence without the constant need for preparation. That sounds simple, but neurologically, it is profound. Because the brain learns more through emotional repetition than through rational logic. And maybe this is exactly where something begins to change. Not when you try to control every thought, but when the system slowly begins realizing that maybe it does not need to keep waiting for danger all the time. Now notice something profoundly important. Maybe the greatest exhaustion does not come from the problems that actually happened. Maybe it comes from the amount of energy the brain spent trying to prepare for problems that never arrived. And that completely changes the way we understand modern mental exhaustion, because many people are not only tired of living, they are tired of anticipating, tired of monitoring, tired of predicting, tired of remaining emotionally prepared all the time. There is an extremely important neuroscience concept called allostatic load. It describes the accumulated wear and tear of an organism that remains continuously trying to adapt to stress and vigilance. It is not only the impact of major events, it is the repeated microactivations happening every day. Small tensions, small anticipations, small worries, small states of alert. All of this accumulates silently, and the modern brain rarely finds enough closure to completely discharge this accumulation. Now think about this. How many times did your mind keep functioning, even after the problem ended, as if the brain did not completely believe it was finally allowed to relax? There is a phenomenon called predictive persistence. When the system spent too much time expecting instability, it continues operating in the same pattern even after positive changes happen. That explains why some people remain tense even in safe environments, continue expecting rejection even after receiving affection, continue anticipating problems even when everything is relatively okay. The brain takes time to update its sense of safety, because prolonged protection changes perception. Now notice something even deeper. The human brain does not prioritize happiness. It prioritizes survival. And for a system that spent a long time in alert mode, survival means staying prepared, even without immediate threat. There is an important concept called defensive energy conservation. The brain tries to avoid negative emotional surprises by keeping part of the system constantly ready to react. But that creates a huge side effect. The person never experiences complete psychological rest. There is always a small residual tension, as if the mind were silently saying, "It's not over yet. Stay alert. Don't relax too much." Now imagine the impact of that on identity. After spending so much time living in a state of preparation, the person starts believing, "This is just how I am. I always overthink. My mind always expects the worst." But many times, that is not personality. It is prolonged neurophysiological conditioning. There is a huge difference between who you are and the state your system became trapped in. And realizing that reduces something extremely important: guilt. Because many people spend years fighting against their own minds, without realizing that the brain was only trying to protect them the only way it learned how. Now notice something interesting. There is a concept in NLP called automatic emotional association. The brain connects internal states to repeated mental patterns. So imagine someone who spent years predicting problems, monitoring threats, trying to avoid suffering, living in emotional hyperattention. The system begins associating vigilance with safety, and then relaxing starts feeling risky, because reducing vigilance means temporarily abandoning what the brain believes kept you protected. Do you see the depth of that? Sometimes the mind is not waiting for something bad because it wants to suffer. It is trying to avoid vulnerability, but continuous vigilance also creates suffering. There is a silent paradox in all of this. The more the brain tries to avoid future pain, the harder it becomes to feel peace in the present. Now notice something extremely important. The human brain learns through bodily repetition. It is not enough to tell yourself, "Everything is okay." The system needs to repeatedly feel that everything is okay. And that happens through concrete experiences of physiological safety. Breathing slowing down without threat. Moments of pause without negative consequences. Silence without the need for constant monitoring. Presence without hyperpreparation. Little by little, the brain begins updating its internal predictions. There is a concept called predictive neuroplasticity. Brain circuits change as repeated experiences alter expectations about the future. And that means something extremely important. The brain can relearn safety. But there is a detail. The system does not change through force. It changes through consistent repetition. Small moments where nothing bad happens when you stop hyper-controlling everything. Small moments where the brain realizes it does not need to anticipate every scenario. Small moments where the mind experiences presence without continuous preparation. Now notice how this completely transforms the idea of rest. Rest is not only the absence of tasks. Deep rest is the temporary absence of the need for vigilance. And maybe that is exactly what so many people have never fully experienced. They stop physically, but remain emotionally prepared. They keep waiting, they keep monitoring, they keep predicting. And then they believe they do not know how to relax, when many times, the system simply lost familiarity with genuine states of internal safety. There is another extremely important concept from cognitive psychology called emotional habituation. The more the brain repeatedly experiences safe states, the more it reduces the automatic need for hyper-preparation. But that requires time, because a system that spent years learning threat does not abandon vigilance instantly. It needs to relearn physiological trust. Now think about something important. Maybe your mind is not trying to destroy your peace. Maybe it is simply functioning through an old survival pattern. And that completely changes the relationship with your own experience. Because understanding reduces conflict. And prolonged internal conflict also feeds activation. Now notice how all of this connects. The brain learns threat. Threat creates vigilance. Vigilance increases monitoring. Monitoring maintains activation. Activation prevents a full sense of safety. And the lack of safety reinforces even more the need for preparation. This cycle is silent, but deeply exhausting. And maybe that is exactly why so many people today live with the constant feeling that something bad is about to happen. even when they cannot explain why. Throughout this video, we saw that the human brain does not wait only for real dangers, it learns anticipation patterns. We also saw how concepts such as predictive processing, negative anticipation bias, residual readiness, contextual neuroception, baseline anticipatory anxiety, anxious temporal displacement, predictive emotional memory, residual nighttime hypervigilance, and predictive neuroplasticity help explain why some people remain emotionally prepared all the time, even in safe environments, even during calm moments, because the problem is not always in the present. Many times, it is in the pattern the brain learned to repeat in order to try to protect you. And that completely changes the perspective. You stop thinking, there is something wrong with me, and begin realizing, my system learned to survive by expecting threat. That understanding changes everything, because what was learned can also be unlearned, gradually, without internal war, without trying to control every thought, without trying to force the brain to shut down. The system changes through repeated experiences of safety, small moments where the brain realizes, I do not need to predict everything. I do not need to monitor everything. I do not need to keep expecting problems all the time. And maybe that is exactly what so many people are searching for without realizing it. Not absolute control, but a genuine sense of internal safety. Now tell me something. Which part of this video made you reflect the most? The idea that the brain learns vigilance? The feeling of always expecting something bad? Or realizing that the mind can remain prepared even without real threat? Write in the comments one word or one short sentence that summarizes what impacted you most in this video. And if possible, try observing something over the next few days. In which moments does your mind automatically begin expecting problems even when everything seems calm? Because noticing the pattern is the first step for the brain to stop repeating it automatically. And in the next video, we are going to explore an extremely common experience that many people live without realizing. Why some minds seem incapable of feeling true rest, even during moments of pause. Because there is a reason why certain people remain mentally on, even when the body finally stops. And maybe understanding that will completely change the way you see your own exhaustion.